You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from Icons, where listeners are introduced to incredible people working within the law enforcement community who have made a profound impact in our world. These one-on-one interviews provide insight into their lives and careers so we can better understand their challenges and recognize their bravery, commitment, and sacrifice. On this episode of Icons, we're joined by guest host Jennifer Alexander, the wife of Bill Alexander, the Memorial's executive director and the featured guest on this episode. Bill and Jennifer sit down to dissect Bill's career in law enforcement, where his career began, some of those experiences, and what he does for law enforcement now that he's retired. As with many of our other Icons episodes, they also talk about home and family life and what impact that has had on their families, difficulties of working in this profession, as well as the positives of serving their community. Join us for this special episode involving one of our very own. And now for Icons, featuring Bill Alexander, Serving Never Sleeps.
Hi, honey.
Hi, honey.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm nervous.
Mrs. Alexander.
I am Mrs. Alexander. Very proud to be so. It's my first podcast, honey.
It's not my first podcast, but I'm happy to be here.
You're a podcast connoisseur. I'm not.
I'm a consumer of podcasts. I wouldn't call myself a connoisseur in terms of content creator, but I'm thrilled to be here with none other than the relatively famous in the local legal community, Mrs. Jennifer Alexander.
I think it's infamous more than famous, but I guess I will take either one. Thanks for having me. Why don't you tell our listeners who you are? We're here at the beautiful National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial and Museum in downtown Washington, D.C., where you work as the
executive director of the memorial.
So how did you get here?
I was in the Air Force for 4 years. Of course, like many young men, I thought in my high school years I was going to immediately depart for some greener pastures at a college, for which my parents were certainly lining me up for. And at some point, even despite the fact I had started attending a local community college, I decided that taking out the trash and cutting the grass once a week was just too much for a young Bill Alexander. And I got a wild hair and off I went and enlisted in the Air Force, much to my mother's chagrin.
That's funny because taking out the trash and cutting the grass is still too much for an old Bill Alexander, too.
I don't know that I would say that. I do successfully take out the trash most weeks.
Yeah. We'll agree to disagree. So what was your duty assignment in the military? You were actually in law enforcement in the military, right?
I did join the military specifically for law enforcement, and it's one of those weird quirks in life where your life could have diverged and taken a different path. I went to the recruiting office, and at the time they had an open slot and offered me what they refer to as a loadmaster in the Air Force.
Sounds sexy.
In which I would have been flying around the world and then being responsible for whatever cargo was on a plane at any time to make sure basically so it was even weighted or leveled out or whatever the specific responsibilities were.
But
and
you didn't want that gig, right? You wanted law enforcement.
Yeah, at the time I was so young and naive, like, no, I want to be a police officer. That's all I've wanted to be. I go join the police department. And I'm not saying here today that I regret that decision, but in hindsight, I do have some fond wistfulness in terms of, wow, I bet you that would have been an amazingly cool job and I would have seen the world in a way that very few people probably could. So I wonder if a young 19-year-old Bill Alexander, knowing then what I know now, would I have chosen differently? I might have. But in any case, yes, I did join the Air Force. I joined specifically to be a police officer. The Air Force at the time was broken into two primary law enforcement categories. One was what they called security police, and one was the law enforcement designator, LE. It was very, very hard to get the LE designation, and I did get it. So security police would be primarily flight line security, sitting on the flight line, watching planes.
At Andrews Air Force Base.
Well, and turns out it was at Andrews Air Force Base. Of course, I grew up in Northern Virginia. I joined the Air Force to go see the world, and I get stationed at, geographically, the closest Air Force base to my hometown, which was both good and bad. I mean, certainly I could have gotten stationed at, say, Minot, North Dakota or something, standing on the rear end of a nuclear missile silo, and that would have been horribly boring. So, there's pluses and minuses, everything. But, in a perfect world, if you could wish to go anywhere, maybe I go to Germany, maybe I go to Hawaii, maybe I go somewhere that's slightly spicier than Washington, D.C.
But because you ended up at Andrews Air Force Base, that's how you got recruited to the Prince George's County Police, right?
I wouldn't call it recruited. I think
Drafted?
no.
Beckoned?
I think I actively pursued the Prince George's County Police Department. Andrews Air Force Base is in Maryland, and it sits in the county of Prince George's. And me and my peers who were law enforcement related, many of those assignments revolved around standing at one or more of the various gates, the points of entry into the base. And it was exceedingly clear to me in a very visceral way that what we viewed as doing law enforcement work on the interior of Andrews Air Force Base was actually not even loosely connected to what real law enforcement officers were doing on the outside of Andrews Air Force Base. And I obviously don't say that disparagingly towards anybody who's in the military police.
Just a more controlled environment on the base.
Yes, there's a distinct difference between the interior of a base, which is largely controlled and, measured by a populace which has been screened to some degree, and our professionals and our American military force versus, civilians on the outside.
But nevertheless, that 4 years of being a police officer with the Air Force must have laid some foundation for you to continue your career in law enforcement, and certainly must have made you a more attractive candidate to the Prince George's County Police Department, which was, at the time, very selective.
Sure. Yeah. So I was in the Air Force. I could see police officers from the Prince George's County Police Agency routinely outside of our gates. Actually, at the time, there was a nightclub called the Hangar Club directly across from the main gate. I don't even know if it's still there.
There was a lot of drama and shenanigans.
Every Thursday night would be ladies' night, and almost every Thursday night there would be a shooting or a stabbing or some combination of serious violence across at the Hangar Club. And not that you want to see violence necessarily, but if there's going to be violence, particularly if you're a young police officer, you would hope to be involved in that kind of response in order to, quell chaos and restore order. That's the kind of police work that most young police officers are looking to engage in. And so I knew very, very early in my career, if I'm going to continue this career in law enforcement, I need to go get involved in an agency like Prince George's County. And so since I was already in Prince George's County, it was very natural for me to pursue employment with them. And at the time, they had thousands and thousands of applicants, which is the reverse of today. Today, they have, and not just Prince George's County, all law enforcement agencies that I'm aware of are facing significant recruiting shortfalls. But at the time, there were many, many thousands of people who were interested in being in law enforcement. And for my 50-person class, they turned away thousands and thousands of applicants. So certainly I was very lucky, and I'm sure by virtue of the fact of my service in the United States Air Force, I'm sure that helped me in terms of competing against those people.
And this was in 1997, so 25 plus years ago. And for those that don't know, Prince George's County, it's fair to call it like a suburb of or in the outskirts of Washington, D.C., so very urban, densely populated, active area.
Yes.
Yeah. Large department.
Yes.
Right. About
plus
half
or
the
minus,
time.
Plus or minus 1,700 sworn officers and another, 500 to 600 civilians.
So you get hired by the Prince George's County Police Department, and shortly thereafter, the love of your life walks through the District 3 doors on a cold Saturday night in November.
Well, I certainly don't know that she was the love of my life when she walked through the District 3 doors.
But you must have had some spark, something.
Well, as I think you recall, I've certainly told this story many, many times since then. I was a young officer.
You were super cute, too.
Full of piss and vinegar, full of wanting to go do real police work. And at the time, having a ride-along was not exactly the most enviable of assignments. It meant to some degree changing your behavior. And I don't mean that in any way, some sort of shady thin veneer of I was going to do something illegal or against policy or, violate someone's rights by virtue of not having anyone in my car, but just the normal social connections. What am I going to listen to on the radio? Is the temperature of my car going to be okay? Is the ride-along going to want to eat when I eat? And none of these are deal breakers to any extent, but to some degree, having someone in your car who you are in part responsible for and also in part trying to entertain to some degree changes the dynamic of any given police shift. So it was not exactly desirable to have a ride-along.
So just for context, so our listeners don't think I'm some sort of badge bunny, right? I was in law school at the time, and part of my curriculum for a class I was taking was I had to go do a ride-along. And Prince George's County is where I lived at the time, and so they said, go to District 3, go on a Saturday night. It's very busy. It's going to be, where you'll see the most of your 12-hour shift with whatever officer they assign to you. So you and I got assigned
We did.
to each other. It was
did.
your bad luck, right? Because you were the early car for the shift that day.
Yes.
And so you were the first one up to have to take the ride along, which they billed to you as coming from the state's attorney's office, even though I was just an intern. I wasn't even a lawyer at the time. I was just interning there while I was in law school. But you were none the wiser and actually thought I was a prosecutor.
I thought you were with the state's attorney's office.
You thought I was
prosecutor.
infiltrating your
Yes.
young career, which had been about a year on the force at the time.
Yes. I thought for sure. Here they come. They're coming to examine my case files. They want to see how I'm making an arrest.
But little did you know, I had zero power and
And zero power, zero experience.
Right.
It was fun, but
And I know we see this story differently
we do.
over the years, but the truth is that within the first 5 minutes of us meeting, we really had our first fight. Fair?
No, I wouldn't describe it as a fight. You threw down a gauntlet where you said you weren't going to get in my car, and I said, well, it's been a pleasure knowing you, and I wish you luck in your future career. And then you gave in for the first and only time probably in our entire relationship.
I think that's what you call revisionist history,
No,
because
I think that is very accurate.
what I remember is that because you were early car, you had an early lockup, someone you had already arrested for shoplifting from a local department store.
Mm-hmm.
And in the course of her being arrested, she urinated on herself in your car, the same seat where you then invited me to sit for the next 12 hours. And to that I had, I think, a very fair and reasonable objection.
No, I might disagree with some characterization of that part of your story.
Well, nevertheless, I think the point of the story is pretty quickly within minutes of our knowing each other, I'm not even sure I knew your last name at the time, we had some banter, as they say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you were pretty, your nickname right on the police force was Captain America. You were a pretty squared away guy, pretty by the book guy. And I knew if I was going to spend 12 hours in a car with you, we needed to loosen it up a little bit.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Now the revisionist
I needed to really
history. You needed to loosen me up.
That's
Is
right.
that how that works?
I needed to just get you to put your guard down
For
a
the
little
listening
bit.
audience, just so they're clear, at the time, and I'm sure it's still the case now, there was a set roll call for each shift that would come in. And so we were on what we refer to as the evening shift. The evening shift started at 3:30, so roll call was at 3:30. But to help accommodate and help transition the off-going shift, day work, and try to prevent them from getting stuck on a long-term call, 2 police officers would come in for what we call early car, 1 hour early, in an effort to alleviate some of those calls and allow the off-going shift an opportunity to go home. So I was the early car, and I had picked up this very early arrest from a department store in Landover, Maryland. And the woman in question had stolen a leather jacket. And to be fair, she had urinated on herself before I got there from store security.
I feel like that doesn't make a difference.
I think it does, because you described it as her urinating on herself in the seat, which is not accurate.
Well, allow me to rephrase. She urinated on herself, and then you put her in the seat, where then you invited me minutes later to sit down.
Yes, and
A cloth seat.
what is the important point that you are purposely not advertising to this listening audience?
Well, you did have, because you are so squared away,
Mm-hmm.
and I know this of my husband now after 25 years, you did have a hefty garbage bag for exactly this scenario in your trunk, because you are a super trooper, right? So you had placed that porous, non-scientific, small piece of plastic between the arrestee's bodily fluids and where you then asked me to sit. But I mean, we're probably boring people at this point. The point is that
You're describing the thick, hefty cinch sack trash bag as porous and non-scientific.
Well, it does
That's
have a
your
large
official
hole.
designation.
I mean, I do think it's fair. It does have a humongous hole by design.
Yes, where trash, including liquids, can collect and not seep through the bottom. So in any case, the seat was very, very well protected from the limited moisture absorption of the woman in question's pants.
Nevertheless, against my better
And
judgment.
then, as part of my normal cleanup activity, I removed said trash bag from the cloth seat, which was now, again, back to its pristine, very clean nature before I had put the trash bag on. And this is what you were fighting me against in our very first, what you refer to as our first fight, is that you said, I'm not going to sit in this seat.
True.
And
I
I
say
said,
that.
well, I really hope you have enjoyed the rest of your night. I'm not sure where else you're going to go, but this is the seat, and you did get in.
And how glad are you that I submitted for the
Mhm.
first time?
Well, let's be real. The only time. That was the only
That's true.
victory I've ever had in the last 20 years.
I'll stipulate to that. That's true.
Okay.
All right. So we're in the car, and I'm trying to loosen you up, and I'm realizing, like, okay, this might be fun, or this might be not fun. And it turned out it was pretty fun, I think. Yeah?
Well, certainly you got to experience what was a not uncommon night of law enforcement-related work across a relatively urban, densely populated area of Prince George's County that borders Washington, D.C., and we responded to and handled a variety of calls for service. Again, not uncommon to law enforcement officers all across the country. So, we saw a man high on PCP who was naked, trying to jump out of his own skin. He was very violent and very upset. We saw some sex workers who may or may not have been addicted to one or more drugs.
And you know what's funny about that story? I remember her. She was quite lovely.
She thought we were very cute together.
She did think we were very cute together. And she, if I recall correctly, said when we had our first child, she was going to knit us a baby cap.
Yes, she did offer to do that. And
Yeah.
I'm not sure where she is now. We should try to collect on that.
Maybe. But nevertheless, maybe she knew something. She was like a fortune teller or something. She knew something that we didn't know.
Maybe.
Only after a couple of hours. But fast forward to the end of a very exciting night where my eyes were like the size of $50 the entire night because there was so much going on and it was so busy. I did not give you my phone number. True or false?
True, but I did not ask for your phone number. True or false?
False.
False?
False. You asked.
Rainbow.
No, that's not, that code word doesn't work on a podcast. The truth is you did ask if I was involved and was available, and the answer was no. And so you said, have a good night. You did a very chivalrous thing.
So, Counselor, your statement was that I had asked for your phone number. You're certainly implying I asked for your phone number. Is that your direct testimony
Well,
now?
the truth is...
Did I ask for your phone number?
Listen, I'll ask the questions here. You answer the questions. This was 1997, 98. We didn't even have cell phones.
Completely
so
immaterial as to whether or not I asked for your number.
Well, the truth is, what we both will agree on is that you did call your sister that night, who at the time, Susan, was probably 16 years old, something like that, maybe not even.
She would have been very young,
Yes. And you did call your sister and say, what'd you tell her?
I said, I think I met the woman I'm going to marry.
Yeah. See? Look at that. So I will let the listeners decide whether you wanted my phone number or not.
I
but
didn't say I didn't want your phone number. I said I did not ask for your phone number. I was very professional.
You were very professional. I agree. And then, we saw each other in court a couple weeks later, and here we are all these many years later. So we get married 2002. After I graduated from law school, you're still, of course, with the police department. We have two beautiful children, our son born in 2005 and our daughter in 2006. So for a while there, we had two kids under 2 while I'm working as, at the time, a prosecutor. You're working on patrol. How did we do that? We had no family in the state. Neither one of us are from Maryland where we've lived. How did we get through that with 2 kids under 2 and 2 full-time jobs and you're working shift work?
Well, it certainly was not easy. And in hindsight, I am equally certain that we did it largely by virtue of you accommodating and shifting your schedule to meet the needs of our children. As many of those dates and occasions, I was, if you're a law enforcement police officer, there's very little give in terms of your schedule. Yes, you probably have some leave balance and you can take a day off, but you can't call your boss and say, hey, I'm going to be 2 hours late today. I need to take my kid to daycare or go to some doctor's appointment. That's not really a reality for most law enforcement officers. You're expected to be there. It's a paramilitary operation in terms of you have responsibilities. You've taken an oath. you receive orders from your superiors and you're expected to be at various shifts, not just to protect and help your peers, but also to fulfill the mission which you're doing. You're trying to be out there to protect the populace, to protect the citizens, and to provide them service. So that's an awesome and very heavy responsibility, and it's not one that a law enforcement officer can easily change or shirk in the course of his or her lives.
I'm sure a lot of law enforcement officers graduate from the academy in their 20s. It's when they're getting married. It's when they're having kids. They're starting a family as they're starting their law enforcement career. Having done that yourself, a few decades ago, looking back, what have you learned in hindsight? And what advice would you give these young officers in terms of their home life and their marriages and their, being a father, being a husband, being a wife, and working these grueling hours, as you say, working in this paramilitary organization that doesn't have a lot of flexibility in terms of scheduling and is very demanding at minimum?
Mm-hmm. Well, particularly when you're in patrol or any sort of subunit, which is working some variation of shift work, I think the number one key to any kind of relationship resolution on that front is communication. I mean, young law enforcement officers have to find a way to communicate the seriousness of their job and how limited they are in their ability to change schedules or be able to take off. Police officers have sworn an oath to be there to protect the members of their community. And you can't easily get out from that obligation by virtue of something going on in your personal life. So to the extent that those young officers can communicate with their spouse or loved one, whoever is at home taking care of one or more of their collective children, they've just got to find a way to communicate that in a way which conveys, I understand you, my spouse, are unfortunately taking on some greater obligation of the family unit, but this is not, I'm not doing that by choice. I'm not doing that without recognizing the cost on you and us and our family.
True, and I think that's so important, the communication. As you said, it's critical for any marriage, but particularly when you have a spouse who's in law enforcement, because as the wife or as the non-law enforcement spouse, I don't see what you see, right? I don't hear what you hear. I don't have, when I go to my job in a courthouse, I'm not afraid of being injured, of being attacked, of having to disarm someone. But when you go to work every day, as they say, right, you're running towards the danger as the rest of us are running away from it. So did you feel like that had an impact on your ability to share with me what you were feeling and seeing? Did you have to compartmentalize that for so many years while we were so focused on raising our kids?
I think it's very common for law enforcement officers to find a way to compartmentalize what it is they're doing at work and try to keep that separate from their home lives. And there's this degree of carrying the burden yourself in terms of what you have seen and what you have dealt with and how that's impacting you emotionally, and then also recognizing that to bring that home and expose your spouse or loved one to that in any meaningful way can cause even further harm is probably not the right word, but certainly I think law enforcement officers all recognize that there's an emotional cost to sharing some of those burdens. And to some degree, your life partner has said to you at some point in your, burgeoning relationship, hey, by virtue of me being your life partner or spouse, that's part of the bargain. I want to share to some degree with those burdens and help you with those burdens. And so I think to some degree it is healthy for law enforcement officers to share some aspect of that. But there are certainly times where, as a law enforcement officer, I would see something particularly catastrophic, some violent act, some tragedy involving a family, particularly small children, being in a position of danger myself, feeling very acutely at various points in my career that I was in extreme danger, and but there, before the grace of God go I, or some combination of small factors, any one of which, if the domino flipped the other way, my name might be out on the wall. Right. And I don't know that you run home to share that level of danger with your loved one, knowing that will really ratchet up the amount of stress that your loved one is feeling every single time you put on that uniform and put on that vest and go to work.
So you just named a few of your duty assignments over those 25 years, majority of which, as you mentioned, was patrol, but you had media relations, you were the assistant commander in the internal affairs division, you were the commander of the busiest station in the county, and you finished your career with being the commander of the police academy, which is the training division, right, at the Prince George's County Police Department. Which of those was your favorite?
The reality is that if you look back on your career in terms of, I guess at its most basic, what was the most fun, it's very, very hard to separate yourself from being in the action, being boots on the ground, having such an immediate and visceral impact, the ability to impact some individual's life in such a positive way. There are very few ways to do that in any profession than being a rank and file sworn law enforcement member, to be out on the street and be answering those calls for service. So I think my favorite would be being a police officer, being out there on the street responding to calls. But certainly various of those assignments after the fact gave me the ability to have a larger impact on some segment of the community of the Prince George's County broader area. And I guess if I look back on my career, I feel like I had the greatest impact, and certainly had the ability to have the greatest impact as a commander of a major station. At the time, it was referred to as District 1, and it is the station in Prince George's County, which encompasses the University of Maryland. So it's a very big geographic area. It's a very big area in terms of the number of the population. It at the time, and I'm sure still does, house the greatest number of citizens in any one district. Employed is the wrong word, but assigned to that station were the most sworn police officers, and we definitely handled the most calls for service and had the most arrests at District 1 while I was there than any of the other stations. So the ability to move and maneuver resources within that community to respond to citizens' concerns, everything from something is going on in my neighborhood in terms of trash, maybe trash dumping or abandoned cars, or speeding up and down my streets, all the way up to and including serious violent crime like carjackings, citizen robberies, and murders. You really do, as a station commander or a high-level commander in any police department, have the ability to not completely eliminate those incidents, but certainly you have an ability to respond in a meaningful way, one, to try to prevent those actions from happening again in the future, and two, trying to mitigate the pain and harm that has been caused to the community. And as a station commander, you have that ability, and certainly I look back on that time and think to myself, I'm so lucky to have been in a position to help influence some segment of the community there in Prince George's County.
I remember very well that time in our lives and in our marriage. That was like a 24/7, even more than the shift work and the 15 years you did in patrol preceding that. That was literally a 24/7 job for you. I remember being at our son's taekwondo competition and you having to leave. I remember being at our daughter's birthday party and you getting a call and having to leave. So there really was no time off. You were never off duty in that position as the commander of District 1. Sure. That must have been stressful for you.
Well, it was incredibly stressful, and being a station commander, I think, not unique to Prince George's County, is sort of like being a police chief for a smaller subsection of the overall agency in which you work. And the responsibilities that entails means that, that's not a 9-to-5 job. That's not a Monday through Friday job. That is you are in charge and responsible for a number of lives directly appointed to you in both terms of the sworn and civilian personnel. But to the next degree, you're also responsible for the lives of the men and women, the citizens of the very area of which you are responsible for protecting. And that is not a job you phone in. That's not a job that you show up at Monday at 9 and leave Friday at 5. You've got to be available, because the reality is your actions, or importantly inaction, can lead to real tragedy, real trauma to that community. And so any agency, anyone who is taking on that level of assignment by virtue of their career and their experience and going up through any agency to reach that rank is going to be eminently aware of what they're signing up for.
There's a lot of stories I can think of from that time, but I think one of my favorite stories, and I'm looking in your eyeballs right now to see if this is okay that I say it, and I'm sensing it is okay, but I'm not positive, but I'm going to go ahead and say it, was when you had to go to a homicide scene under the influence of prescribed Ambien. Do you remember that?
I do remember this.
Right?
Yeah.
So you had, and for the record, since we're literally on the record, it was prescribed Ambien, but it was like, what, 10 o'clock at night? You'd already had a long week. You were ready for bed. We were ready for bed, and you needed some sleep that night, and you took an Ambien, and what, 20 minutes later got a phone call that you needed to report to a homicide?
Yeah. Well, at the time, our chief at the time had a really... He had a multi-part plan, and his mission and his sort of broad view of violent crime and murder specifically was that there was something intangible that you could pick up by virtue of going to murder scenes. Not that you were going to go show up to the scene and immediately solve the crime. Not that you were going to show up to the scene and recognize some single factor that you were going to be able to influence to stop the next kind of murder. His feeling was that by virtue of going to the murders that were occurring in your district, you were likely to pick something up. Again, maybe you wouldn't be able to articulate exactly what it was you were picking up, but you would be able to pick something up. Some part of the community, some part of the scene, some part of connecting with, emoting with the family, the victims, the people involved, the community. And I bought into that vision wholesale. I also believed, much as my chief did, that was having an impact. It was something that you might not be able to measure, but you could feel was you were picking something up. So at the time, he had a very strong vision, and he said that all district commanders had to respond to all murders that occurred in their district. And so, of course, on that week, I remember I desperately needed some sleep after a long week. And so I did take one of my, what you refer to as prescribed Ambien. And of course, within 15 or 20 minutes, I got the call that I had just had a murder in my district. And what did I do?
You very responsibly, and maybe as the first and probably only police commander in the history of our country, took an Uber to a homicide scene.
That is correct. I took an Uber to the homicide scene.
I offered to drive you.
Yes, I recall, but I didn't want to what? Bother and burden my wife driving me up to some murder scene at 11:30 at night, on a random Thursday or whatever it was.
I remember helping you get dressed in your uniform because you were a little woozy, but you were insistent. You were going to go. You are Captain America. You are Mr. Team Player. You were not going to. I suggested maybe you call the deputy chief and explain the situation, but you're like, nope, getting an Uber.
Again, much as, sort of we've discussed broadly already, that's not a job that you, listen, if you take that job, you take it very seriously. You say, I'm a member of an executive leadership team. I recognize that I have great responsibility here. And the idea that I was going to phone that in or somehow, call in sick for a murder scene was basically impossible for me.
So you albeit wobbly, got in your uniform, waited for the Uber to our house.
Yes.
Had to somehow explain to this Uber driver
that
what
when
he
they
was
arrived
about.
on scene and saw a bunch of blue lights, this was not an Uber sting and he was not in any trouble. Yes, I recall having some conversation like that.
And why he has a uniformed police commander in his car. It must have been very confusing for that Uber driver. And maybe he's telling that story on some podcast, but
I don't think it was confusing. I think to him, it was almost like a ride along. I think he was sort of excited at the idea of I'm going to a murder scene and I'm taking the police.
So you took your Uber to the murder scene, fully uniformed, and you get out and you go, I think you were going to go talk to your deputy chief, and you tell him like, hey, I took an Ambien 30 minutes ago, whatever it was, 45 minutes ago, just to let you know if I say or do something irregular. Mm-hmm. And what did he say?
He, of course, said, oh, Bill, you should have called me. I would have told you not to come to the scene. Which,
who else said that?
Which was 100% false. I don't know that that's actually what he would have said, but that is what you would say after I'm already on the scene. So, and the reality is, even if I had called him and he had told me that, I still would have gone. I would have gone.
I know you would have gone. I know you would have gone. And there was no sense in trying to persuade you because I knew you were going to go. It was you have a strong sense of duty, and that's one of the many reasons I love you.
Well, the reality is that I fundamentally believe that the vast, vast majority of law enforcement professionals out there feel and accommodate that same sense of duty. I mean, I just feel it in my bones. So to the extent that any part of our conversation today resonates with anyone in the public, I hope that they can take some assurance from me, a prior law enforcement professional, that that sense of duty is so common and runs so deep within the law enforcement profession.
So 29 years in law enforcement with your military law enforcement, and then your 25 years with the Prince George's County Police Department ultimately led you here, as you've described to me many times, a very sacred space. And tragically, you know more than a few people whose names are now on the wall.
Yeah, for the 25 years I was on the Prince George's County Police Department, we lost 16 officers, all men, all of whom have their names inscribed on our very sacred walls right outside, just the memorial right outside. And of course, I have mentioned that before, but I always hesitate mentioning it. I don't say that or bring that up in terms of somehow shifting or making the story about me. But I do bring it up, particularly when I talk to groups out on the memorial, to just give them a sense that the fact that I know more than a dozen men whose names are out there on the wall is not uncommon. That so many within our profession, there are only so many degrees of separation between every single law enforcement officer you come into contact and them knowing personally someone whose name is on our very sacred walls. So when I talk to the public particularly, I try to instill in them that there is a very, very real cost to being a law enforcement officer. Even if your name doesn't end up on the wall, by virtue of the fact that you are in this profession, you almost certainly know someone who has sacrificed everything in service of their community in this country. It is a very, very heavy burden. And so I hope that when I tell people I know personally at least a dozen men whose names are out there, I hope that resonates to some degree. The other part of me saying that is that, particularly for the members, the men and women in this profession, when they come to the wall, they expect that all of us in the profession, but particularly those of us here at the Memorial Fund, are honoring the promise to never forget the men and women whose names are out there, that we will always be here to tell their stories, to tell the stories of the men and women, not just whose names are on there today, but whose names will inevitably be added in the years ahead as we continue to add names every single year, unfortunately, and very tragically.
How many names did the Memorial Fund add to the wall last year, 2022?
619 names in 2022, and we are likely set to add more than 500 in the spring of 2023.
So, from the family dynamic, which is part of why I was asked to come here and interview you today as your wife, and certainly not a professional podcaster, but as your wife, that must take an enormous toll on police officers like you, knowing that risk, that very real risk, that very heavy burden exists, and that you might not make it home like so many of the men and women whose names, like all of the men and women whose names are on that wall. So how did you handle that dynamic as a police officer, knowing you had a wife and kids at home that you wanted, of course, to get home to every night?
Well, I don't know that I gave it a ton of thought while I was in law enforcement, in terms of there was never a time where I was suiting up and I was thinking to myself with some level of trepidation, oh, I'm getting ready to go to work and I might not make it home. Of course, I'm not saying that thought never crossed my mind or doesn't routinely cross the minds of any number of men and women who are getting dressed and getting ready for work. You're putting on the very instruments which you hope will protect you and the people around you should you be forced to confront and intervene in some violent, deadly encounter. Things like a bullet-resistant vest, things like the tools on your duty belt, and in the worst, most extreme cases, your firearm, which you hope never to have to fire. But the reality is, most days, tens of thousands of people die every year in auto accidents. I don't think most people go and leave their house, get into their car, and think, there's a chance I might die in a car accident today. I think most people in law enforcement suit up for work and go to do the job that they've sworn to do, and it's not a constant reminder in terms of, or thinking about some level of, I might die today. Now, having said that, so much of the profession is centered on, thinks about, talks about, is trying to tease apart data, coming up with new programs, highlighting existing programs that make it safer for those who serve. Certainly that is an ever-present topic of conversation and part of the training of law enforcement men and women around the country always. How can we make this job safer, not just for the men and women who are doing the job, but also safer for the public, which are, sworn to protect. But I wasn't constantly roving around thinking I might die today.
Early on in your career, we had maybe only been dating a month or 2 months. You were involved in a departmental shooting where someone did die.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, to me, totally uncharted waters, having just been in this law enforcement world with you for weeks, literally. And I remember how scary that was for me, even though you were okay. That was pretty scary. And this was back in the late 1990s when the national narrative on policing was much different than it is today. So that must have put some fear, maybe fear is not the right word, but some concern in your mind when that reality really hit home when you were involved in a shooting.
Sure. It was incredibly stressful. Being involved in some sort of departmental shooting, at least that's what we refer to it as, and lots of organizations called officer-involved shooting. It is incredibly stressful, and I am 100% certain that the stress factor for that has only increased dramatically over the last decade, certainly over the last few years. There is so much scrutiny, and I don't mean to say that such scrutiny is not unwarranted or unfair. The public should have a right to understand how and why officers are using force, but the level of scrutiny now is much, much higher even than it was when I was in my departmental shooting. And there is a level of stress there, feeling like I took some action and it's possible that the greater populace or the members of my organization find fault in what I did. And should they find fault, it's not just possible, but probable that I will be held to account for that in a way that impacts me for the rest of my life. And not just me, but my entire family, my spouse, my kids. Can I pay my mortgage? Will I go to jail? Those kinds of things are very, very tough layers of the stress sandwich that comes inevitably after you've been involved in a shooting. And that's not even touching on the fact that more likely than not, assuming the shooting was fatal, you have participated in and helped take another human life, which is just another layer of lots of self-introspection and thinking about what is the job I'm doing, how and why have I gotten to this place where I've had to take another human life, and with the full clarity of 20/20 hindsight, did I do everything that I could have to avoid taking that action? Do I think I did the right thing? Now, in my case, 100% I felt I had done the right thing. In most cases, I think officers feel the same way, but there is no question that officers can and will second-guess themselves after the fact because it is such a heavy burden to have taken someone else's life, and you only want to do it in the circumstances in which you have really no other choice.
And in your case, the case was investigated, if I remember, for about a year or maybe a little bit more.
Yep.
By the state's attorney's office, by internal affairs, by the folks that investigate these officer-involved shootings. And, of course, you were completely exonerated in that situation given all of the facts and circumstances. So exonerated maybe isn't the right word, but you were completely cleared of any wrongdoing.
Yes.
In terms of that shooting. But even that year off was stressful for you because you weren't out on the street in patrol doing what you wanted to be doing, and was stressful for me too in terms of watching you, and we were living together at the time and knowing how anxious that must have made you and how anxious it made me. So how did you get through that? How did we get through that?
That was a very, very tough time. That was an incredibly tough time because you just referred to it as I was off for a year. That doesn't mean I was not working. The department, at least where I work, I know some departments across the country have a different sort of mechanism whereby they screen and ultimately put officers back to work. And in some cases, they are able to accomplish that relatively quickly within a few days or a week. But in Maryland, and specifically in my county, the process which was set up and is still in place today is that an officer is basically suspended from normal patrol duties and is not able to return to full work until the state's attorney's office has issued what they refer to as a decline to prosecute letter. So in our case, because it wasn't just me, it was a number of additional officers involved in a departmental shooting, I think that complicated the case to such a degree that it took them longer to figure out what it is they wanted to do or whether or not they viewed our actions as lawful. ultimately they did, but it took a long time. It took 10 months for them to issue that letter. And so to be off for 10, again, I'm saying off, I was still doing administrative duties, but not doing the job that I so loved and so wanted to be a part of. You're segregated from your squad, the very men and women I mentioned earlier that you have these strong connections to, the fabric of your, more than just professional life, the fabric of your life. They become something way more than just coworkers. And to be separated from them for any period of time and to then see and hear their stories, knowing that they were still out there doing the job and you're sort of sitting on the sidelines waiting, that was very stressful. And of course, the really stressful factor was that the state's attorney's office could have come back even then 20 years ago and said, hey, we find that this shooting might be problematic. And that would have been just the fact of not knowing what their ultimate decision was going to be was also incredibly stressful.
Definitely takes a toll on anyone's mental health, no matter their fortitude, no matter their internal strength. And you happen to have you happen to be a very strong person in terms of your mental fortitude, and you handled it very well. Remember your calmness, almost too calm, because some might say, not everyone, but some might say I'm the opposite end of that spectrum. Maybe that's why we work, but it still must take a serious toll on the mental health of police officers now, when they're involved in those very heavy, life-changing, split-second decisions. So I know here at the memorial you have a pillar for officer safety and wellness that addresses mental health for police officers. So what resources did you have available to you, or do you wish you had available to you when you were going through that very stressful time?
Well, I work for a relatively large department, and I think certainly departments and chiefs of police and leaders of public safety organizations have been thinking about, talking about, doing more than talking about, implementing policies and procedures which impact and hopefully influence the mental health of the men and women under their charge. And while I think almost everyone in law enforcement would say that we needed to do a better job over the last 50 years of that, I feel like the department that I joined, even in 1997, had largely turned the corner in terms of recognizing that there is a toll on officers' mental health. Not just if you're involved in an officer-involved shooting, but just the nature of the police work itself. So we had a separate psychological services division is what we refer to. We had mandatory screenings. If you were involved in some sort of serious, catastrophic or fatal event, you had to go see a psychologist and talk to him or her. There was ongoing, you had to go back to training. You had to have multiple layers of conversations with both people inside and outside your chain of command in an effort to give the various layers of that command an opportunity to screen the officer in question. Are they doing okay? Do they seem to have any of the signs or signals that might indicate they're having problems related to whatever incident they were on? Do they need additional help? Have we offered them all of the help, whether that's the employee assistance program or our direct psychological services division or an outside party, whatever it was? I think even early on in my career, I was very lucky to have joined a department that was so proactive in thinking about that and pushing officers into avenues of help. And that has only strengthened and gotten more intense and serious since I joined the police department. I mean, now there are so many layers of mental health and assistance and screening and checking and training of supervisors and your peers, all of whom are not constantly, but certainly frequently being reminded, hey, this is a stressful job. Be mindful of your peers and your subordinates and your coworkers and the people around you. Are they exhibiting some sign or symptom of the mental stress and the toll that this job takes on you? And if you do see such a sign, you have an obligation to say something to your whoever supervisor in an effort to get the officer help.
So very heavy stuff that you dealt with literally daily, but also lighthearted stories sometimes too. And one of the favorites of mine is your David Pogue story. You know what I'm referring to, your David Pogue. Yeah, oh boy is right. I'm going there. So this is my first podcast, really, but you are a super tech guy. For those of you who don't know you, you are an Apple fanatic. You are a technology wizard, and that is not an overstatement. But tech is like your thing. Fair? Can we agree?
I think we could agree on that.
Okay.
Sure.
And so you've been listening to podcasts since before podcasts were cool, right? You've been listening to podcasts for a couple decades, probably.
Maybe not that long, but certainly I was listening to some of the earliest podcasts, yes.
And one of those earlier on podcasts was done by a guy, David Pogue. He was with, the New York Times?
Oh, no, you're conflating podcasts with just me being aware of various tech stories.
Oh, that's right. It wasn't David Pogue's podcast. Well, you tell the story. You were listening to a podcast and there was a call for help.
No. There was
okay, you tell it.
I just became aware of through social media and some tech websites. Specifically at the time, there was a site called Gizmodo, and
it's for tech nerds, right?
Yeah, and that site is long gone; it's defunct. But they posted a story where this New York Times reporter, David Pogue, had lost his iPhone. That was very early in the days of the iPhone and the Find My feature of a phone, where you could, if you lost it, you could go through Apple's specific app and you could find the location, at least GPS location, of your device.
So this was probably like 2008 or 2009 or so?
I actually don't remember the year, but, plus or minus 12 years ago.
Right.
So David has lost his iPhone, and of course he's a big tech reporter. He's got quite a following on social media, and he posts to his social media, "Hey, I can see my phone," in what was Seat Pleasant, Maryland,
which is within Prince George's County, where you work.
Within Prince George's County, and he says something like, "I wonder if anyone can help me get my phone back," or something along those lines. He was clearly, the reality is that even now, even then, I was sure he was sort of fishing for a story. What a cool story if somehow he could be reunited with this phone. But in any case, he had thrown this out into the wild, and some tech reporters had sort of picked that up and started to run with it. And this one site, Gizmodo, of course, called the Prince George's County Police Department, non-emergency number, to say, "Hey, this tech reporter has lost his phone, and he just posted a screenshot of it, and it shows that it's in Seat Pleasant, Maryland. Will you send a police officer over there to get the phone?" And you can imagine the response of the non-emergency person who answers the phone. "Wait, who are you? Whose phone is it? You're calling me to tell me that somebody else, not related to you, a third party, has a phone, and it may be in a house in Seat Pleasant, and you would like me to send the police over there?" We didn't have any policy or procedure for that. And so they, of course, politely declined this reporter's attempt for someone to go get the phone. So I am watching this story unfold almost in real time on the Gizmodo site as they're posting these various updates.
And were you working part-time or secondary employment?
Yeah, I was working a part-time job, getting ready to go into an evening shift where I was the shift commander in charge of 2 squads, one of which was responsible for Seat Pleasant, Maryland.
So you're familiar with this area. You're ready.
Intimately familiar with the area. I know where the house is. I know that I'm going to be there in a couple hours. So in my mind, I go, I'll go try to find this guy's phone for no other reason than I'm into tech and, and I was an Apple guy, of course, an iPhone guy. So I email the reporter on this story and I go, "Hey, not for nothing, I happen to be a law enforcement officer and I do work in the area where this, where David's phone is alleged to be. I say, this is not the official policy of the Prince George's County Police Department. I am not responding officially on behalf of the Prince George's County Police Department. I'm not saying to you that anyone else who loses their phone in Prince George's County can call up and get in a response like this."
It's a lot of disclaimers there.
Yeah, a lot of disclaimers.
It's like you're married to a lawyer or something.
I said, "But if you can connect me with David in some manner, I am happy to go to attempt to retrieve his phone." And so, sure enough, somehow they got a hold of David, and then David ended up calling me, and by over the course of the next hour and a half, I explained to him who I am and where I'm going, and I show up at the thing, and
David Pogue actually called you.
Yes,
were you geeking out over that because he was like one of your tech buddies, celebrity?
No, he was not a tech buddy, and he's a tech reporter. So in any case, I call the sergeant for the squad who's supposed to be working evening shift, and I say, "Hey, let's have roll call in the court of this guy's house, wherever this phone is."
Literally on his street.
Yeah.
So you had your squads come to roll call on the street where this house is allegedly housing the stolen iPhone.
And so then I showed up to the appropriate house and I knocked on a few doors because the GPS signal was sort of bouncing between what could have been 3 possible houses in the court of this, residential neighborhood. And the first house is a duplex. A woman answers, and she's got some kids inside. And I, explain, hey, this tech reporter lost his phone. He says he lost it on an Amtrak train. Is there any chance you found a phone and you have it? She's like, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. Move on to the other duplex half of the house. Guy answers, I don't know what you're talking about. I go to the other houses where this phone could be, one of which is being torn down to the studs by a crew of day workers. None of them speak English. I'm reasonably confident they don't have David Pogue's phone. And then the other house, no one answers. So I'm intermittently calling David and saying, hey, can you activate the Find My feature where it plays a sound on the phone and maybe I'll hear it? And, it was about this time, I've already knocked on the doors. It's about this time that, 10 or 12 marked police cars start rolling into the court so they can have roll call. And, I'll spare the audience any further drama. I think some combination of me knocking on doors and still asking questions and perhaps the plus or minus 12 uniformed officers in the court ultimately convinced the guy in the one half of the duplex to come clean that he was an Amtrak employee and he had in fact found David's phone, and here's the phone. So, it was a success story, and we shipped the phone back to David, and he was very happy and grateful for my involvement. But, that story singularly sort of put me on the map internally of the police department in terms of my tech awareness, and then ultimately getting me into media relations where, I'm sure that catapulted my career in ways that I never would have foreseen and never would have pursued had that singular story not happened.
You always tested for your promotional assessments from officer to, PFC, corporal, sergeant, lieutenant. And then you really, I remember, loved being a lieutenant. You loved that assignment, and you were hesitant, I think, about moving to test for captain. Did you feel hesitant to keep going up the ranks in your promotional assignments?
Well, there was something very special and unique about being a shift commander, at least on our agency. That was the rank of lieutenant, and it was the last tenuous connection you could have to real police work. So I
before you became really a commander or on the executive leadership team.
But once I went to media relations, where I was lieutenant, I knew that my fate was sealed, at least in terms of having interest in wanting to pursue further promotional opportunities.
And you did that, and you became a captain, and then within like a year of making captain, you were promoted to major.
Yeah.
And that's when you really took on a lot of different roles and a lot of different responsibilities. Because how many majors are in this 1,700 person department?
On our agency, there were about maybe just shy of 20.
And are you, in hindsight, do you think your trajectory up the command staff pole to major was the right move for you? Or do you think back and wish you would have stayed in patrol as that shift lieutenant that you
No. It was 100% the right decision for any number of reasons, not the least of which would be, contributing to my family through my retirement in a meaningful way through a higher base salary. But, I wouldn't say that's even at the top of the list. The reality is that if you want to have an impact on the community in which you are charged to try to keep safe and give back to, even as we've discussed earlier in this conversation, one of the ways you can do that is contribute in a meaningful way to the men and women who work for you, contribute to your community, and take greater leadership roles. Insert yourself. Take the ideas and the experience which you've learned over the course of a lifetime and use that experience, particularly patrol experience, in a way to shape and influence and hopefully prevent crime from the very communities which want nothing more than to feel and be safe in their environment.
Well, I'm so grateful 25 years ago that I walked into the District 3 station and met my husband of the last 20 some odd years. And I'm so grateful to have been asked to come here and share some of our stories together. And I love you.
I love you too. I wonder what would have happened if you had turned away at the completely dry, completely clean, safe seat in the front where you were otherwise fighting me.
Without question, you would have actively pursued me, potentially through illegal means, and undoubtedly would have stalked me until I submitted to your invitation for a date, which our first date was at a very swanky place called TGI Fridays. Yes, yeah. TGI Fridays.
Very high class.
Super high class. I was super impressed.
As I recall, you were trying to impress upon me that my Coors Light had a much lower alcohol concentration than your Heineken.
That is a fact. Everyone knows that Heineken has a significantly higher alcohol concentration rate than essentially flavored water, which is what Coors Light is.
Okay, well.
But again, everything happens for a reason, and however many Heinekens I had, and however many Coors Lights you had, 25 years later, it seems to all have worked out okay. Any do-overs?
No.
No?
No.
That wouldn't change a thing.
No.
All right. Me neither.
Okay.
Thanks, honey.
Thanks, honey.
Love you.
Love you too. Rainbow.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Icons, featuring Bill Alexander and guest host Jennifer Alexander. We hope you found this conversation enlightening and will join us again for another edition of Icons, where we introduce listeners to incredible people working within law enforcement who have had a profound impact on the community. These one-on-one interviews provide insight into their lives and careers so we can better understand their challenges and recognize their bravery, commitment, and sacrifice. The Icon series is not just about contemporary figures in the law enforcement community, but about all those who have served their communities and the world, from now and in the past. Be sure to tune back in with us for future Icons episodes exclusively on Tuesdays every month to learn about key figures in American law enforcement history. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.